June 9th, 2003. We're at the Peabody Public Library. We're interviewing Janice Hammer today. President or myself, Janet Skank, the director of the library. And I need to ask you, Jan, what branch of the service were you associated with?
The Army.
The Army.
Mm-hmm.
And in what war?
World War II and the Korean War.
The Korean War. Okay. Jan, were you married when the World War II started?
No.
No? When did you get married?
August the 29th, 1942.
1942, so you were married during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Was your husband in the service at that time?
When we married?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
He was.
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the was he drafted or did he enlist? I assume he went in right before World War II started,
Yeah,
or right after?
He went in before World War II started, before Pearl Harbor.
Before Pearl Harbor?
Yeah. He had a commission and was called to active duty.
I see. And where was he stationed before he was called to active duty? Or
He was working as a civilian in Pennsylvania at Armstrong Cork Company.
okay. And you were not married at that time?
Oh no, didn't know each other.
Didn't even know each other then?
Mm-mm.
Well, how did you guys meet then?
Well, I was a junior in a little college in South Carolina for ladies, and my next door neighbor invited me to come home with her between semesters, and she lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and of course Fort Bragg is right outside of Fayetteville. And so she was dating a young lieutenant at Fort Bragg, and so she asked me if I'd like a blind date. So I said, yes, that would be fun. So my husband and her date were very good friends, although he wasn't my husband then. And so I went out on a blind date with this young lieutenant from Indiana. And Ann said, if he thinks you're cute, he'll either take you to the officers club or to this roadhouse. I don't remember the name of it. So when I got home that night to her house, Ann said, well, which one did he take you to? And I said, he took me to both of them. He thought I was really cute.
And what year was that then, Jen?
1942.
1942.
Mm-hmm.
And you were married that same year?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In Fort Bragg? Or
No, in Roanoke, Virginia, my home.
at your home?
Yeah. Yeah, he was sent out to Fort Sill and then came back to Fort Bragg and wrote me a letter and asked me to marry him. And I said, oh, yes. So that was...
And how much time did you get? Was he sent overseas, or was he basically stationed?
Yeah, oh yeah, he was sent overseas.
How long were you together before that happened?
Well, let's see, this was in August, and then we lived at Fort Bragg for a while, and then he was transferred to Camp Maxey, Texas, and we went out there. And then he was transferred to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and he went overseas from Camp Shelby, Mississippi in 43, I guess it must have been.
And what did he do when he was in the service? What was his duties?
Well, he was a field artillery officer, and they shot the big cannons. He got involved in observation.
What does that mean? I'm not...
Well, after the war started in Europe, he would go up in these little planes and observe and then relay the information back to headquarters.
What were you doing while he was away?
Well, we were married after my junior year in college was over, and so he wrote me a letter from Europe saying he knew my father, who had recently died, would be very disappointed if I didn't go back and get my degree. So I went back to college, a little college near Roanoke, and got my degree. And of course, all the men were gone, and they were just desperate for people who could teach. And I had no classes in education methods at all, but they were really desperate, so I taught school until after the war was over. Taught English and one class in algebra that nearly killed me, and in fact I was teaching GIs that came back after the war was over.
Really?
Yeah. So
Were they finishing high school, or what grade
they were
you
finishing high school so they could go to college under the GI Bill, but they had to have a high school diploma before they qualify.
And were you in, while your husband was serving, were you living then in Roanoke, Virginia? You stayed
yeah.
in Roanoke, Virginia? That's where your family is from then?
Yes,
Okay. How did you guys communicate? I mean, I know, was letters, you wrote letters?
Oh yeah, wrote letters.
And I've heard about either V-mail or something.
V-mail, yes.
What is that?
Well, that was, you filled out a form with all the pertinent information, who it was to go to, and then they would take pictures, and then you'd write your letter, and then they would take pictures. So they would take maybe an 8x10 piece of paper with all of your message on it and reduce it to maybe 3x4, and then would send those. So of course,
Did that go like from the serviceman writing home, or from you writing to your
both.
husband? Both. It went both ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And of course you had to write a letter every night.
You did? Did you write a letter every night?
Oh yes, yes, yeah, everybody, all your friends went home, your girlfriends, and either they were married or engaged or interested, so that's what everybody would do every night, either before or after some activity that we were involved in. And Jim was very good about writing home too.
And what was your husband's full name then?
His full name was James Edward Hammer.
And he served in the Army. What was his rank?
When he retired, he was a full colonel.
He was a full colonel. Okay.
But when I married him, he was a second lieutenant, making $125 a month. I never saw so much money in my life at one time. Never even dated anybody that was making his own money before.
That was a lot of money then, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting.
A whole lot of money.
How many did he get to come home often during the war?
Never.
He never came home until when did he?
Well, after the war in Europe was over, everybody that was there thought they would be sent to the Pacific. But then the war in the Pacific was over just a couple months later. So then everybody wanted their son or husband to come home immediately. And my husband was in the regular army. He was not just called up. So they left all the people that were in the regular army in Europe and in Japan and brought these other people home. So it was almost a year after the war was over.
So
before.
in 46 that he finally get home. So he was gone from 43 to 46, 3 years. Didn't get to see him once. Well, let's talk about the home front then. How about shortages? How did that affect you where you were living?
It really affected me because I had never cooked the first thing in my life, and then all of a sudden everything was rationed. Meat and butter and canned goods, everything was rationed. Coffee, sugar. I remember we had ration books, and I remember my husband took the ration books and went out to the commissary to do some shopping, and he came home and he was so proud, and he said I was able to get 10 pounds of sugar, 5 pounds on each of our books. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. He said, I got 10 pounds of this sugar that's got XXX on it, which he didn't realize meant powdered sugar instead of granulated sugar. I didn't say anything, but I was really irritated. He wasted all our sugar stamps. But things were difficult. But you didn't say anything because it was the war effort.
It's difficult for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How about socially? What kind of things did you do?
Well, as I say, all the girls were home, so we played a lot of bridge. Roanoke had a Red Sox baseball farm team, and we used to, in the spring and the summer, we'd go to the baseball games. And then we followed the high school athletics. Movies, we went to the movies. Really very, very quiet social life. But something I'd like to tell you that maybe nobody else has mentioned. When someone in the service was killed or wounded or missing, the way they would deliver that message to the family was Western Union had hired a lot of old men who were not able to serve, and of course they couldn't use cars because gas was rationed, so they would deliver these messages, these old men riding bicycles. So whenever you saw one of these old men riding a bicycle coming down your street, you just, held your breath that it wasn't coming to your house. So, yeah. And my classmates, the men, a lot of them were in the 29th Division. That was composed of Virginia National Guard. And they were one of the units that was instrumental in making the landings on D-Day successful. But we lost, I don't know how many men from my class in high school, and their pictures would be in the paper at night, and it would just break your heart to see all these young men that weren't going to come home. And we've only had one reunion, high school reunion, in all those years, and I think it's because so many were lost and people just didn't want to face the fact that all those people wouldn't be there. I think that's why.
Very well be.
Yep.
Very well be.
Yep.
Okay. How about your parents? Were they involved?
No, my mother died when I was just 4, and then my father died while we were at Camp Shelby.
Camp Shelby.
So, no, I didn't have any family.
Did you have an extended family then?
No.
But you stayed in Roanoke.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything that you want to add, Jen? Any stories or things that have happened that you remember? Something that stands out in your mind? Something important?
Yes. When Jim's unit went overseas from Camp Shelby, he of course was on the advance party, and so he left, and we couldn't find anybody to drive home with me, and I was going to have to get from Mississippi to Virginia, and so I took the dog and got in the car and drove all those miles on retread tires at 35 miles an hour with the dog, and I'd have to first check to be sure the hotel would let me come in with the dog, because he was a big dog. And I finally made it home, but that was quite
How long did that take you?
I think 4 days.
That's not bad.
It was forever. And I was like 22.
Did your tires last?
Yeah, they did. They did. And the car lasted during the war. After D-Day was over, and we thought the war was going to be over, any minute now. That was when Hitler had that big push up through Belgium, and they had that Battle of Bastogne and so forth. Of course, my husband was involved in that, and that was at Christmas time, and I didn't hear from him. I think it was 6 weeks and 4 days. And of course you were scared to death, you know, you were going to get some bad news, but he survived that. And then also, he happened to be up in one of those little planes observing, and saw that the bridge across the Rhine, I think it was the Rhine, at Remagen was still standing. So he radioed that information back to headquarters, and that was the only bridge across the Rhine that was still standing, so they rushed all these troops down to take advantage of that bridge. So he got a nice award for that. Then Jim came home on rest and recuperation leave, 45 days, almost a year after VE Day. And then after he went back, then I went over on the second ship taking dependents over to Germany. And I'll never forget it. The name of it was the USS President Tyler, and it had been a troop ship in World War I. And I don't know how many women and crying babies and little children were on that ship. Anyway, something happened to one of the engines, and we limped across the Atlantic. We were towed through the English Channel and finally got to Bremerhaven. But I think it took us like 30 days or some awful amount of time.
How long after you said after the war had actually ended, they let the dependents go over then?
Well, it ended in June, and then he came home the following spring, and then I went over late in the summer.
Oh, I see.
So it was about a year.
And how long did you get to stay in Germany then?
I didn't want to leave. But before, I had to drive to New York from Virginia to get on the ship going to Bremerhaven. And I don't know how old I was, but I wasn't very old, and I had never been to New York. And I was driving a new car because my uncle had the Ford agency, and he didn't think that old car of mine would last very long. So I was driving a new car, and I drove through the Holland Tunnel and came out, and there were these signs saying uptown, downtown, crosstown, and I wanted to get to the Hotel New Yorker. I had no idea. I stopped the car, I started crying, and policemen came from everywhere because this was at 4 o'clock and the tunnel was just packed with cars. And one officer said, "I'm just going off duty, I'll drive her to the New Yorker." So he got in the car and drove me to the New Yorker, which was very nice of him. I don't even know his name, but I sure was crying. They probably thought, "Oh Lord, what's this we've gotten into?"
A lot of people cry at the Holland Tunnel, Jim.
Then, when I got to Germany, Jim was stationed at Fulda, which is a little town in Germany. And while we were there, I had 2 interesting experiences. One, I went with him to a big celebration that the Polish people, the displaced people from Poland that had been held in Germany in prisons, were going back to Poland. And they had this big party, and they got on these box cars, and the box cars were all decorated with evergreen boughs and flags and all these things. And one of the men that Jim had befriended before gave me a bracelet with the crests of the 7 Polish divisions that had fought against the Germans. And I still have it. In fact, I saw it today, which made me think about it. But when the train pulled out, they were singing and happy, and oh, it was wonderful. Then another thing that happened is on Christmas Eve, we walked to the cathedral in Fulda to the midnight mass, and it was snowing, real big, heavy snowflakes. And the cathedral had been bombed, so a lot of the roof was missing, and they had big evergreen trees, and they had candles, white candles on the trees, and they had lighted these candles, and the snow was coming down through the open roof. It was the most beautiful mass I think I've ever been to.
The trees were inside the cathedral, were they? Oh, that does sound beautiful. Beautiful.
Then Jim transferred from the field artillery to the Corps of Engineers, and we were sent, or he was sent, and I went along to Berlin. And when we were in Berlin, we lived in a house called, and we were in Schönauer Park. There were 5 houses in the park. 3 of them had been destroyed, and then the house we were in and one other. I don't know what I did with my time, because the U.S. government was trying to pour money back into the German economy. So you were issued servants according to your husband's rank. And there were just the 2 of us, and we had a housekeeper, a cook, a maid, a gardener, and a driver. So I don't know what I did. The housekeeper, her name was Katharina Müller-Grote, and she had married into a very wealthy publishing company. And in fact, it was in our family, and it was in her parent-in-law's home that Truman stayed when he came over for the Wannsee conference in Berlin with Stalin and Churchill. And she had been married to a pilot in the German Air Force who had been killed. And all she had was just a little, like maybe a 2x3 picture of him in his uniform. And she had it in a pretty little sterling frame. And she had one little teacup that was all she had left of her wedding china. It was Dresden china. When the Russians arrived, they threw all the china out, and that was all she had. And she had some very horrible stories to tell about when the Russians came, what they did, and so forth. And at that time, we were very friendly with the Russians. I could drive all around Berlin, drive over into their part of the city, not think a thing about it. And I would drive for block after block after block and not see a thing standing. It was just utterly destroyed. But the Russians were our friends, but Katerina would say to me, "You just wait and you'll find out who your friends really are when you get to know these Russians." But the Germans were starving to death. The only people that were really eating were the farmers. Cigarettes were worth we could get them at the PX for 5 cents, and they were worth $100. My husband wouldn't let me deal on the black market because he said he wasn't going to have somebody come knocking on his door in the middle of the night and arresting him for dealing illegally on the black market. But the Germans would come to the door and knock on the door, and if I would happen to go, they would have maybe a piece of velvet in their hand, and they would smooth it out, and there'd be loose diamonds. They'd sell you those for anything you'd give them to eat. And the cook, Katerina lived in our house, so she ate what we ate, but the cook would take home the potato peelings, the coffee grounds after we'd made anything that she could take home to feed her family.
Right.
Something we'd throw away. I was trying, there was a young officer in Jim's battalion who was married to a woman who was the daughter of General Clay's chief of staff. So we got to go to a lot of fancy parties because they would take us along. So we got to see a lot of things. But then my husband was chosen to go to Command and General Staff School in Fort Leavenworth, and we had to come home. And I was sick because I knew I'd never have anything like that again. One of the things was we would only buy on in the commissary. We couldn't buy from the Germans at all, and we couldn't buy any milk that came from Norway because that just went to families with children. We couldn't buy any lettuce or anything we were going to eat raw because they so often used urine for fertilizer, and so we weren't allowed to use that at all. So
that's interesting.
And when I went on a trip to Paris and London with 3 other wives, and we got to Paris and we just ate salad after salad after salad. We were so hungry for that. But we came back
To Fort Leavenworth?
To Fort Leavenworth.
Now, did your husband stay in the service between World War II and the Korean War?
Oh yeah. In fact, he stayed in until they told him he was too old to go to Vietnam, and he retired.
Was it always his plan to make a career out of the Army?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
So,
always.
So he served in the Korean War, and then when Vietnam started, they wouldn't let him go because he was too old, so he resigned. How long had he served by then?
29.5 years. So
usually it's 20 years. Isn't 20 years what people consider a career? So he did pretty well.
Yeah, yeah.
Where were you when you knew that he was going to be going to Korea? Remember where you were?
Where were we? In Virginia, I think. I think he was in the Pentagon, and we were living in Alexandria, Virginia. So, but that was a long time ago because Lucy wasn't born yet, and she's almost 50.
Yeah, Korean War started within 50. It started around then.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, oh, I didn't really mean you were almost 50, Lucy. And then Lucy married someone my only child, married someone in the Air Force, a pilot in the Air Force.
How'd you feel about that?
Well, I loved the service. I really did. I can't think of anything bad I could say about being married to someone who was in the service. So I was thrilled to death for her because she was going to get to do all these exciting things. So
now, you didn't get to go to Korea.
No, that was during the war.
Yeah. Because I don't know whether they let families go to Korea after the truce was signed or not.
I think they did because, see, they're still over there.
Yeah, that's true.
So they probably are still over there. Jim didn't have very much to say about that.
About Korea?
I don't know really why, but he didn't. But
Was he a full lieutenant colonel during Korea?
No.
No.
No, he was a lieutenant colonel over there. But he got his promotion to full colonel when we were down in Panama.
So you got to travel the country, travel the world pretty much. It's wonderful.
So
let's go back to World War II. You said you stayed in Virginia while your husband was overseas. What kind of... I have been told that people back here did support the war. That all kind of drives and things like that. Were you involved in any of that?
No, not really that I can remember. I was kind of busy going to school and then teaching, but everyone was involved. You know, I had a cousin who, a first cousin, who graduated from high school one day and joined the Marines the next day. And his mother and father, you know, just worried themselves sick. But in fact, my Uncle Joe would say the two men that won World War II were General Patton and Jack Taylor, his son, Jack Taylor. But You know, you bought war bonds, you did everything to try to, and you didn't hear anyone saying anything derogatory about anything that was going on. Everybody really supported it. And I remember on not on VE Day, but on D-Day, when the troops were landing, all the churches were open, and you only got to see 8 gallons of gasoline a week. And so you really thought about where you were going to drive. But everybody went to church, and all the churches had services. And
were you aware on D-Day that D-Day was happening?
oh yes, oh yes.
How did you find out about that? Were there announcements
The
or
radio.
the radio?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I didn't realize that it was that instantaneous that you would know that day that was happening.
Well, we got a lot of time difference.
Uh-huh. Who told you?
Oh yeah. And then of course the minute one person heard anything, you know, then you called everybody you knew. Yeah. Yeah. So it was a exciting time to be alive. But I think one thing that is so different today is we're so critical of people in authority. Whereas if Franklin Roosevelt had told me to eat mush 3 times a day, I would have eaten mush 3 times a day.
There's a difference in our times then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But learning to cook when everything was rationed, that was something else.
Anything else to add, Jan?
I can't think of anything. No, except I think this is great that somebody's doing this. And I think it's great you're letting the wives get something said, because they kept up the morale. And see, you didn't send Christmas packages or anything like that.
You didn't?
Because they, you know, anything they sent had something to do with the war effort.
Okay. I can understand that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Jan, thank you for letting us interview you.
You're so welcome.
Learned an awful lot.